Our next presentation in this series around historical trauma is from Professor Joe Gaughan, who is an associate professor of psychology and American culture, Native American studies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And Joe also has been a stalwart of these meetings and of our network, and in fact did one of the case studies of the healing programs of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation some years ago. And so we're delighted to have you.
I'm really delighted with the opportunity to talk with you today. Thank you, Lawrence, for the invitation for convening this again. As Lawrence said, I'm a clinical and community psychologist by training. My research has to do with the intersection of culture and mental health in American Indian communities, typically in the United States, although I've done one project here as part of the network that I'll reference briefly as I'm talking in a bit. And so as a psychologist, I'm thinking about these issues and bring that kind of disciplinary background to how I consider these issues. I want to really pose a critical question today, and that question is this: is therapy culture properly suited to redressing the contemporary ills of Indigenous communities? And I really want to develop this question a little bit and put it on the table for discussion with reference to really 4 constituent domains. The first is really some background framing as one of those domains. It's having to do with the historian sociologist Michel Foucault. Now, as a psychologist, I'm no expert in Michel Foucault, but I have read Discipline and Punish, and I think that just providing a bit of broad background brushstrokes will help us here. As those of you who do know Foucault will recognize, he was concerned with issues of power and of discourse, and has these affected or intersected with personhood, and talked a lot about how subjectivity as a form of lived experience is shaped by power in social interactions. In Discipline and Punish, for example, he talks a lot about how the ability to impact people shifted over time historically from external forms of surveillance and control. Gives a very graphic example of an instance of regicide where someone tried to kill the king, and they're really publicly and graphically tortured to death, essentially, as a means of discouraging that kind of efforts by other people in the population. By moving from those kinds of external forms of surveillance and control to internal forms of surveillance and control, to get people to take up or pick up on their own and to internalize a kind of self-discipline, self-control in areas that are important for matters of the state. And you'll recall in this picture here, we have a prison, a diagram for a prison, Bentham's Panopticon prison. This features at the end of Discipline and Punish. And the beauty of this particular design is that you've got a central guard tower in which prison guards can look out and observe all the prisoners who are in cells around the periphery. And the prisoners' cells have a glass wall or a see-through transparent place where they can be open to observation at any time. But the prison guards themselves looking out from the center have opaque glass where the prisoners don't know if they're being watched. And so this is the perfect example of the internalization of self-surveillance, because prisoners do not know if they're being watched, so they start to take on monitoring of themselves and making sure they act in accordance with rules and so on, because they don't know if the guards are watching them or not. So this Panopticon prison is one example of a kind of Foucauldian institution in which we see this shift from external forms of surveillance to internal forms. He, of course, in his career wrote about the military, wrote about asylums and psychiatry, and wrote about schools. And so my main points here, just in terms of setting up this background frame, are that there have been historical shifts in the organization and exercise of power, and these have led us to take up or to take in practices of self-surveillance and self-discipline in service to interests that are not necessarily our own, and that these shifts have occurred through modern institutions that affect large numbers of people, including the fields of both education and mental health, as Foucault traced in the birth of both schools and asylums. So that's the backdrop, and then I want to talk about 2 more components that I think I'll bring into an intersection with this background in mind. So next I'll move into a consideration of Indigenous boarding school experiences. Fortunately, I can provide a very brief background here because this is a subject of a lot of discourse and conversation about Indigenous issues, especially in Canada, so I won't say a lot about this. But as you probably know, these schools were invented by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who was a U.S. military officer, following his fledgling efforts to work with Native prisoners in a more humane way than Native prisoners were typically worked with at that particular time. He went on to establish the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania in 1879. And this, of course, was seen as the peak of Indian reform at the time. This was a very progressive stance to take, that Indian children should be educated and assimilated into mainstream society. And these formed the basis of the recommendations of Nicholas Flood Davin in his report to Parliament in 1879 in Canada, which is in some ways moved the model of boarding schools into Canada. Now, as I said, this at the time was a politically progressive solution to the so-called Indian problem. It was at the same time also very overt in its goal. The slogan was "Kill the Indian, save the man." So it was all about eradicating the cultural savagery that Indians supposedly occupied and rehabilitating Indian people into mainstream society. So an overt civilization campaign that involved educational partnerships between churches and the state. There were some 200 boarding schools between our two nations. They were similar in philosophy and practice very early on. One thing that's important, especially in the States, is to characterize the particular time frame in which you're talking, because really prior to the Merriam Report in 1928 is a period when you might think of these as heavily assimilative kinds of institutions, but there were reforms. There are government-run boarding schools for Indians today in the United States. Some of my family members have gone to them. They're run by the BA, but they're mainly Indian-run today. So they're a very different phase now than they were, and it's really the kind of abusive stuff we're talking about dates back some time in the United States, maybe less so here, obviously. Of course, tens of thousands of Native students throughout the century went to these schools. But it's important to keep in mind, too, that's still a minority of Native kids who would have been school age at the time. So not even a majority of Indian kids ever went to these particular schools. Main points I want you to take away from this are that many schools, especially early on in the United States, represented a fusion of Foucauldian institutions. That is, they blended features of the prison, military, and school practices. And moreover, the very limited resources for these schools, because they were never funded adequately, included this limited funding, poor training of staff, ethnocentric ideologies, vulnerable wards as children, and a general absence of accountability. Sometimes we were in distant, far-flung places where the government rarely visited to check up on what was going on, etc. And this, in fact, precipitated widespread abuse of Native people, children, as we well know by now. Not to mention death. I mean, there were high death rates at many of these schools. It's interesting as to why we've chosen to focus on abuse as opposed to death in terms of how we think about charges against the nation states, but that's probably a topic of discussion perhaps. Indeed, then, it's the long-term spiritual, cultural, and psychological impacts of these abuses that figure so centrally in both historical and biographical narratives about Indigenous experiences in the boarding schools. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission obviously is highlighting those, as Professor Neeson said. Okay, now I want to shift to a third domain here, which has to do with Indigenous historical trauma. Historical trauma, as it has emerged, is primarily a health concept promoted by Native social work researchers and professional psychologists. It originates really with Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart in the mid-90s, who undertook psychoanalytic training and had a chance in that context to undertake a psychoanalytic framing of the Holocaust trauma from supervisors she was working with and so on, and transport that into an Indigenous context. Beyond this, it also, of course, partakes heavily of the psychiatric illness known as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which entered the DSM in 1980. And so historical trauma is seen as a kind of an elaborate form of PTSD that takes on particular dynamics that differentiate in important ways. And of course, identification of boarding schools or residential schools as a key source of historical trauma for Indigenous people have been going on for some time. This is more so the case in Canada, where it seems to be where all the action is. In the US, people certainly talk about boarding schools, perhaps because that legacy was older, again, prior to 1930 there, and also because there were all kinds of military actions that are, and overt campaigns of genocide in some instances. Perhaps it's not as pronounced in the United States as it is here. But in any case, the boarding schools, both places, has taken on this identification as a source of this kind of traumatic experience. Now, the colloquial meaning of historical trauma, as many people in communities might use it, could translate into something like post-colonial distress. And I don't think there's any problem if that's what a person means on talking about it in that way. But post-colonial distress might actually be a better language to use because, first of all, post-colonial talks about the present as much as it talks about the past. It's not just fixed on the historical. It's about the current product of historical processes. And distress, of course, is much broader in terms of a set of responses than trauma proper. So one can have all kinds of reactions to the legacy of colonization. And distress can allow for a number of these that could involve things like grievance or indignation or things that don't shade into pathology. But once you're talking about trauma, you're really kind of entering the world of psychopathology, and so it kind of constrains a little bit of the kind of subjectivity that might be in reference here. The academic meaning of historical trauma is much more clearly spelled out and in some ways much more specific. First of all, it's a blending together of two older concepts that we can all recognize, a concept of historical oppression, which we've commonly talked about, I think, in many circles in Indian country, but also a blending of that to this notion of psychological trauma. Now, psychological trauma kind of emerged, obviously ideas of psychological trauma have been around a long time. If you read Alan Young's book, Harmony of Illusions, you get a very nice background about the origins of traumatic understanding and thinking. But in terms of becoming more popular, it's really in the wake of PTSD, entering psychiatry, being legitimated, that you start to get a takeoff in the modern way of we think about psychological trauma. And these two wedding together, these two concepts of historical oppression and psychological trauma as historical trauma is cast then within a rubric of the social determinants of health, drawing on public health discourse as well. Now, this reflects a kind of recent shift, I think, as well. In some work I did in the 90s, I talked with a grassroots traditionalist in my own community who had an elaborate way of linking current psychiatric distress, even like alcohol use disorders or major depressive disorder, to colonization. But interestingly enough, never invoked much psychology at all, outside of just what I kind of required of him because of framing it in this way. His account was historical and spiritual, not really psychological at all. So there's a way in which psychology has entered Indian country, being reflected, I think, through the popularity of this notion of historical trauma in the past 20 years or so. The goals of people who promote the idea of historical trauma, I think, are understandable and in some ways quite worthy. The goal is to contextualize Indigenous health problems, to destigmatize the kind of paralyzing self-blame that Native people can have if they feel like it's their own fault that they're sick or distressed in really dysfunctional ways. To legitimate Indigenous therapeutic traditions as ways of trying to help folks in these communities, and of course to expand knowledge, policy, and practice in healthcare systems and services. In doing so, they really have refined a particular notion of historical trauma, what I call the 4 C's of Indigenous historical trauma. The first of the 4 C's is colonial injuries. That is, Indigenous historical trauma is first and foremost about mass group oppression or genocide or massacres, reservation captivity. There's other kinds of aspects of colonization that come into it, but it's about colonial injury first and foremost. You might have other tragedies on reservations and so on, or even Indian on Indian warfare, but that's not what people mean when they talk about Indigenous historical trauma. They're talking about Europeans perpetrating crimes against Indians. The second C, beyond colonial injuries, is that it's collectively experienced. I think Amy referenced this, that there's dynamics that may come on board when things are happening to people en masse or as a group, and this collective experience is something that goes beyond individual notions of post-traumatic stress disorder, and so that's how historical trauma differs. Third, it's cumulatively escalating. The idea here is that, okay, so you're chased down by the army, you're locked away on a reservation where you're half starved, that these kinds of things create greater and greater legacies of distress as they fold together in the course of a person's life. So cumulatively escalating. And finally, the fourth 4C is that it's cross-generationally transmitted. That there is something that's passed down from grandparent to offspring that puts them at risk over time. And the idea here is not just cycle of abuse stuff, like I'm violent toward my children grow up to be violent toward their children. That's kind of mundane. Human services people get that. It's something, what I think theorists will sometimes refer to as secondary traumatization, that something is passed where I'm not overtly traumatized by my parents, but somehow I'm more susceptible to things that go awry in my life than I would have been if my parents hadn't experienced or my grandparents hadn't experienced such things. So this cross-generational transmission, that's a kind of secondary traumatization. This is where people get very excited about epigenetics, because that seems to be a way of kind of Lamarckian inheritance being passed along in ways that aren't like cycle of abuse stuff. So in the end, historical trauma is understood then to snowball through subsequent generations unless it's healed. And this is another really important part of historical trauma, that this stuff needs to be addressed therapeutically or it's destined to go on forever. Generations will always be at risk unless intervention occurs. Now, healing is broadly construed. It can involve traditional healing or forms of cultural practice that are understood to be therapeutic. But because these people are all health professionals and are trained as clinicians typically, therapeutic interventions from Western mental health services are also a big part of the picture. So usually healing includes not just traditional approaches, but also clinical mental health approaches. So the main points I'd like you to take home here are that boarding school abuses are regularly designated as a primary example of Indigenous historical trauma that's harmed former students in ways that are said to convey a legacy of ongoing psychological risk and disability for their descendants. This legacy is thought to carry forward in more or less indefinite fashion, potentially growing worse along the way because of the snowballing effect, unless or until it is addressed by means of therapeutic intervention. All right, last but not least, I want to talk about therapy culture. It's important to note here that historical trauma was developed and promoted by Native health professionals with clinical training. And clinical intervention is recognized as an important component of the healing process of Native people from this. So I myself have studied this on the ground as part of the network's evaluation of Aboriginal Healing Foundation healing projects, in which I explored the meaning of healing in One Manitoba Healing Lodge. What's really interesting about it was there was a lot of commitment to Aboriginal cultural identity and Aboriginal inclusion or integration of Aboriginal cultural practices into the therapeutic setting. But at its core, it was really quite familiar as a form of therapeutic intervention. It was about getting people to recognize that their childhood contained great trauma and pain, that they had carried these burdens, psychological, psychic burdens, their entire lives, and that the only way they could heal from those burdens as it was affecting their lives in negative ways was to cathartically, verbally express tell their story, express their narratives in counseling, confidential counseling spaces, whether it was in group work or one-on-one. And that once one did that, one inaugurated a healing journey, which was characterized primarily by kind of introspective, self-reflexive exploration that was to continue through your entire life. So this is all very clearly, I think, therapeutic culture in some respects. And so it raises the important question in my mind of how liberating or emancipatory is therapy culture of this sort. Now, scholarly attention to therapy culture started in the 1960s. In some ways, these are heirs to the Foucauldian legacy, which is why we started with Foucault in a way, interested in discourse, personhood, and power. There's a number of analysts who've looked at this in psychology. Philip Cushman has proposed that there's an empty self. But in human services more generally, sociology, history, and so on, Philip Reif wrote in 1966 about the triumph of the therapeutic, Andrew Polsky's The Rise of the Therapeutic State, Nicholas Rose, Inventing Ourselves, Eva Moskowitz's In Therapy We Trust. There's a little cottage industry of books that kind of explored the way the side disciplines have come to shape lived experience in modern society. And today I just want to briefly sketch the argument of Frank Furedi in his 1998 book, Therapy Culture, in which he's really talking about the US and the UK. And his argument, again, in very brief brushstrokes, is that first, modernity has eroded old systems of meaning, especially religious systems, and that therefore people are no longer furnished unambiguous expectations about their purpose, their role, their status, or their direction in life. And this leads to the fragmentation then of modernity. And therefore individuals become responsible, or really even obliged, to chart their own path and make their own meaning. This obligation of charting your own path, making your own meaning as an individual afloat in the world, can become very disorienting, anxiety-provoking, isolating, and burdensome. And in the context of the fragmentation and individuation wrought by modernity, therapy culture has emerged to fill this void through the realization of self-actualization and self-fulfillment for otherwise disconnected or fragmented individuals. So modernity brings great disorientation, anxiety-provoking isolation, but therapy culture says, well, we have the solution for you. We can help you self-actualize, we can help you self-fulfill. Furedi's critiques of therapy culture, however, are quite illuminating. First of all, he feels that therapy culture circulates new scripts for emotional vulnerability and an attending preoccupation with the vulnerable self. This is why we have endless conversation these days about self-esteem, emotional abuse, psychological survival. He writes, quote, "This is the age of traumas, syndromes, disorders, and addictions." Moreover, therapy culture promises self-actualization and self-fulfillment as a remedy for modernity. But in fact, he says, it promotes a diminished sense of self and a, quote, permanent consciousness of vulnerability. In other words, what it's really promoting is not self-fulfillment, but psychological fragility. Therapy culture promises to combat alienation and isolation, but he says in reality it promotes further individuation, not connecting to others, but rather becoming even more isolated. And it does this, he says, in two ways. First, by stigmatizing informal relations of dependence, like among family members or friends or the people you used to get support and help for when you're going through a rough time. Now we have notions or terms like codependence, which means that it's suspect for you to rely on other people in this way because that could be indicative of pathology. Instead, you should, he says, number two, push for reliance on professionals instead. So instead of informal relations of dependence, you need help. You need the experts to come in. You need to see therapists and get professional assistance if you're really going to recover from your issues. Therefore, therapy culture appears to involve a retreat to the interior realm of the private self. But in reality, what it's doing is it's opening up this private realm to professional management in ways that have increasingly become the business of government and other institutions, says Furedi. In other words, therapy culture involves the professional colonization of everyday life. Now, if we assess Furedi briefly, we can say that, okay, he's a bit derivative, he's kind of come lately in this stuff and is drawing on other people's arguments. It's a little overstated. It's that kind of nostalgia that worries me sometimes about the good old days when we were all self-reliant. He's got a political axe to grind very clearly. But I think he also captures key elements of many other of these kinds of analyses about the way therapy has proliferated in our societies and the implications for selfhood. In sum, Americans and Westerners in our increasingly globalized world are becoming more individuated, disconnected, and isolated, says Furedi, and such hyper-individuation is increasingly accompanied by disorientation, anxiety, and vulnerability. But therapeutic technologies are increasingly promoted as a solution. In reality, though, they're exacerbating this problem. So I just want to leave you with some questions. On the basis of this analysis, we might ask in this context, that is the context of the legacy of residential schools and so on, what it means when entire generations of Indigenous peoples are said to suffer from historical trauma and to be at risk for psychosocial problems. We might ask what it means when community-based healing projects promote ideas of emotional woundedness, cathartic verbal self-expression, and self as project introspection as the core of their therapeutic activities. What does it mean when Indigenous clients arrive to treatment programs as a result of pressure by social workers and courts of law to obtain such services or face even less desirable alternatives? And this was true of a lot of the clients that I saw in the work that I did in Manitoba. These are not voluntarily knocking on the door, give me help. These are people who say you're going to take your kids away if you don't go. Successful Indigenous treatment clients inaugurate their healing journeys and begin to promote therapy culture throughout their communities. What do we do? What do we think about that? So to return to the critical question I posed at the outset, is therapy culture properly suited to redressing the ills of Indigenous communities? Let's just consider for a minute. Indigenous peoples today are seen as continuing to bear the wounds stemming from the boarding schools. Healing from these wounds is regularly stated to involve therapeutic approaches and interventions that reproduce and expand in our communities various facets of therapy culture. But therapy culture has been criticized for amplifying the very problems of disorienting individuation, emotional vulnerability, and professional dependency that it claims to redress. Finally, and most significantly, therapy culture exposes Indigenous selves for intrusive management by professional authorities who are increasingly themselves Native, and often in the context of government payment for such services. That is, I worry then that this involves a socialization into practices of self-surveillance and self-discipline of the kind that Foucault warned us about in works like Discipline and Punish. In closing, I'll leave you with two rhetorical questions. Is this what Indigenous liberation and emancipation from disciplinary paternalism of the boarding schools should look like? What might Indigenous self-determination response to the boarding school legacy look like if we pursued justice more so than healing? Thank you.